Welcome, everybody, to another episode of our series, In Conversation, brought to you by the We Believe Alliance, which is a combination of We Believe in Israel and the National Jewish Assembly. This evening, we have two extremely informative guests. We have Richard Kemp, who's a former British Army officer and respected security analyst, best known for his leadership in counterterrorism and his commentary on modern warfare and international security. He served for nearly 3 decades in the British Army forces, rising to the rank of colonel, and played a central role in shaping the UK's response to global terrorism, including heading the government's international counterterrorism team at the Cabinet Office. During his military career, Colonel Kemp commanded troops on active service in regions such as Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Iraq and Afghanistan, gaining first-hand experience in complex conflict environments. His expertise in asymmetric warfare and counterinsurgency has made him a prominent voice in discussions on national security. Following his retirement from the military, Colonel Kemp has become a widely sought-after commentator, appearing regularly in media and speaking at international forums. He is particularly noted for his outspoken views on counterterrorism strategy, Western foreign policy, and the challenges posed by extremist groups, drawing on his operational background to provide practical, experience-based insights. We also have this evening Jonathan Sacerdoti, who's a British journalist, broadcaster, and commentator, known for his work across television, radio, and print media. With a focus on international affairs, politics, and social issues, he has contributed to a wide range of outlets, offering analysis on topics such as extremism, Middle Eastern politics, and cultural trends. Sacerdoti is also recognized for his appearance as a commentator on major news networks, where he provides perspectives on current events with an emphasis on clarity and context. His work often reflects a strong engagement with issues affecting Jewish communities and global security, alongside broader geopolitical developments. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for having us. And Richard, thanks for being here. It's great to see you again. We always seem to meet in the midst of wars.
Yeah, normally a bit closer though than we both are at the moment, I think.
That's true. That's true. The last time I think we ended up in the bomb shelter together, though you were. I must point out to everyone you were reluctant, ever the soldier, but I said we must. So there we were. That actually was the first war with Iran, the 12-day war. We were a bit further than 12 days this time round, and obviously a much bigger engagement. And I've been reading your commentary on it. It's been pretty scathing about Britain's position, as I've seen it, and I wonder if you can explain a bit more about that. Like, do you think that Britain was in any position particularly to help, given the fairly poor state of our preparedness for war?
Well, I think you make a very good point, and Britain's defences have been severely neglected over many decades now. Not just this current Labour government, but pretty much all previous governments since the Cold War have constantly slashed into our defences and spent the money that should have been spent on defence on social welfare and health, etc. Now, of course, all those things, both of those things are important, but defence is also important. But it wasn't important enough, in the view of the various parties that have governed this country, to, in their view, to attract sufficient votes to make it worth spending money on. So it's simply gone downhill, and it's never really recovered from the period under John Major, I think, when there was the first options for change review of defence, which cut it very severely just after the Cold War. And that did leave us in a position where there's not much Britain could do, either in its own defence or in defence of the Israeli-US alliance. But it could have done something. It could have made contributions. It could certainly have taken part in airstrikes against Iran, and also against Hezbollah in Lebanon. It could and should have taken part in both of those operations offensively. It did actually only contribute a relatively small part of the defensive operations in defense of Israel during this current conflict, not the conflict that's going on now, but the period since the 7th of October, when Iran attacked Israel before, in April and June last year. And we did make some contribution to the defense of Israel and other Gulf allies during that war, or during those two periods. But we could have done more, I think, than we've done. In fact, what we've done is to obstruct this war, and we've obstructed it predominantly by refusing to allow the US, initially refusing the US at all to use the British bases or the American bases on British territory in Diego Garcia and RAF Fairford. Eventually, after I think a great deal of pressure came upon Prime Minister Starmer, we agreed to let them use it for defensive purposes only. It's a little bit blurred and it kind of characterizes, I think, a lot of this government's policy on defense and security. It kind of blurred the issue a lot. But that's our sole contribution, a sort of grudging acceptance that the Americans can use some of our territory, and that's in the face of constant threats against Britain, the firing of at least 2 drones, I believe, from Hezbollah in Lebanon against British sovereign territory in Cyprus, and now most recently the apparent firing of 2 or attempted firing of 2 ballistic missiles towards Diego Garcia. And not forgetting, all of this is just recent. In the past, Iran has attempted numerous terrorist attacks within the UK. It's killed dozens of British soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq during the conflicts there, both directly and by its sponsorship of its proxies. So whether or not Britain likes it, we're a part of this conflict, and we're an enemy of Iran, even if we don't consider Iran to be our enemy, or politically we don't. So I think it's pretty shameful the way that the British government has behaved over this. And the reason, in my analysis, the reason for it, the sole reason, is, well, there's 2 reasons, as a matter of fact. The first reason is that Keir Starmer is in a very weak position, with a number of leadership contenders snapping around his ankles, huge dependence for current support and future elections on an alliance of the Islamic community in the UK and also the radical left in the UK, who he depends on, obviously both of them very heavily, and is concerned about alienating them any more than he has already. And we can see his reaction to that situation going back to the shameful partial arms embargo that he placed on Israel soon after he came into office, at a time when our ally Israel was fighting a defensive war, an existential war, and by also sanctioning Israeli government ministers and by recognizing an entity that he calls the State of Palestine, which doesn't exist and is never going to exist, in my opinion. Yet he did that again for the same reasons, not because of any. I don't think he saw any of that as being particularly impacting on the conflict in the Middle East, but it did impact on his political support at home. And the second reason, I think, I suspect, I don't know for sure, I suspect that he would have been much more supportive of this conflict if it had just been the US and maybe Arab countries. But the last thing he could do, in my view, is to join a conflict in which Israel was involved. that would be too much for him. And not only that, but ultimately when Hezbollah, I assume, fired those drones at British sovereign territory in Cyprus, there's been no response. There's been no attempt to attack Hezbollah in Lebanon. And that is, again, because that would have required coordination with the dreaded Israel, which controls airspace over Lebanon. So that's my summary of the situation at the moment.
Now, with these missiles that were unsuccessful, but they were launched towards Diego Garcia, which has been in the news for a number of other reasons. What's been the sort of secondary part of that story is that, well, everyone noticed that Diego Garcia is quite a long way away from Iran, as is most of Europe and even the southeast of the UK. And there's now been this discussion over whether or not they've got the capability to actually launch missiles at us here. And certainly Benjamin Netanyahu has spoken in the wake of the two fairly horrific missile hits from yesterday in Arad and in Dimona. And he said, well, Europe, you should take note of this, because on the one hand, you can see that they launch missiles at civilian populations willingly, and also you can see that they have the range to go much further than you might have assumed. And actually, I was reading that it's not even news, because we're hearing from the UK response. They sent out the housing secretary today, which is a odd choice, I felt, on the television, to tell us that actually the military is well prepared and there is no threat. But there was long-standing concern that Iran might launch longer-range missiles for years. Back in March 2019, there was this letter that the permanent representatives of France, Germany, and the UK to the UN wrote to the Secretary General, expressing serious concern over Iran's ballistic missile developments. And they noticed that there's this one missile that they got a new conical warhead design for it, and that this meant that it could go much further. Smaller and lighter. So there was already the concern that modifications like that, in the eyes of the UK, meant that they had a much longer range. And yet today we're hearing, in response to an actual launch of missiles on British territory somewhere away from Iran, that there's nothing to worry about. Do you think they're just digging further and further into the hole that we're in?
Yeah, I think that's true. And we've also heard phrases from the defense secretary when he went to Cyprus straight after the drone attack there, when he referred to the targeting of Cyprus. He said it was, almost said it was random. These drones just happened to hit RAF Akrotiri's runway, or one of them did. Clearly trying to kind of, I think, duck away from the responsibility to retaliate. And we heard also from the Foreign Secretary the talk of reckless firings of missiles, including the missiles fired at Diego Garcia. Again, reckless implies it's not really targeted at us. It's just sort of lashing out wildly, which is not true. It's very clearly targeted. And I think taking that approach, and also I did hear the Housing Secretary's very wise words this morning on the BBC, I think it was, or on the media generally, when he essentially said we have the capability of dealing with this situation. We have the capability of dealing with missiles should they be fired from Iran or anywhere else at us. And I'm afraid that is simply not true. We do, and he was careful to kind of praise the strength of the armed forces, but I'm afraid it's misguided. And I'm not in any way casting any aspersions on the members of the armed forces. But as I mentioned earlier, the armed forces have been starved of capability. We have such limited ability to deal with this threat, whether it be from ballistic missiles or from drones, whether it's from Iran or from anywhere else. Our most capable defensive mechanism is the type 45 destroyer, which we've eventually sent one of them churning its way out to the Mediterranean. I think it's there now. But those are the most effective air defense systems we have in this country. And they're not really designed to protect the UK. They're designed for protecting the fleet from missiles at sea. Yes, of course they can help, but we have no really effective means of defending our country from any of this. And we don't even have, and okay, it's, we've gone through a long period of comparative peace at home, even though we've been involved in a number of wars at long distances. But at home, we haven't really faced an air threat for many years. And we now have, we've completely neglected not only the air defense capabilities, but also protections of our citizens. Now, I'm not saying that we should have as extensive a complex of shelter systems and warnings as Israel has, but we certainly need to be thinking about that. I think I'm right in saying that the vast majority of Israelis that have been wounded or killed as a result of drone or missile strikes has been those who haven't made it into the shelter on time, either because they couldn't be bothered or because the warning system failed in one or two cases, I think. But we should bear that in mind. And particularly as we don't have anything like not even a shadow of the air defense capability that Israel has. So yeah, we're in a pretty desperate situation. As to those missiles that were fired from Iran towards Diego Garcia, I don't know enough about their technical capabilities, and I suspect the IDF does, but I don't. And I don't know whether they would have reached Diego Garcia. One misfired in flight, apparently, and the other was shot down by US air defenses. And if they had reached their target, I don't know whether they would have been able to carry sufficient payload, explosive payload, to do any real damage. I just don't know the answer to that. We have to assume that they could have reached the target, and we have to assume, in the absence of any other knowledge, that they would have done some significant damage if they had. But I think, Eyal Zamir, the IDF chief of staff, said quite plainly, and you made the point that we were already aware of this, but he emphasized it, I think today or yesterday, that these missiles, the same type of missiles were fired, would put London, Paris, etc., in range of the Iranian missiles. And okay, Britain has to make its own decisions about what it considers the risks and the threats. But I would certainly take very seriously something that the Chief of Staff of the IDF said. I suspect he's probably in a better position than almost anyone in the world to make that sort of judgment. So, yeah, I mean, I'd just be interested to know how seriously the government's taking this threat, whether they are actively seeking to develop our air defences, and indeed whether they're looking at the possibility of some kind of protection for citizens on the ground, like as the last time we had missiles and drones as well fired at us was in 1944, 1945, when we had a comprehensive shelter system in the UK, including extensive use of the London Underground. Now, the London Underground remains in place and is even bigger, so would offer significant protection to British citizens in London. I don't know whether the government's actually turned its mind yet to thinking about that or planning for that. Maybe they have. I hope they have. But ultimately, one point I would like to finish on is that for air defense in Europe, and it's not just Britain, it's the other European countries as well, with the exception of Ukraine, for air defense in Europe, we are heavily dependent on the United States, as are so many countries around the world. So on the one hand, we're happy to refuse to cooperate with the United States when it's dealing with a threat that threatens us as well as Israel, as well as the region, while at the same time we're totally dependent, really, I think almost totally dependent on them for our air defenses.
Right. I mean, I agree with that. I just filed a piece actually for The Spectator for tomorrow, talking about a lot of this. I mean, the Type 45 destroyers that you mentioned, I think we've got six, right? Royal Navy Type 45 destroyers, and it seems that I think only two or three of them are actually usable at the moment. The others are in, I think, long-term maintenance till 2028 or thereabouts. One of them, as you said, has been sent over rather belatedly to defend British, the British base in Cyprus, and that leaves one, maybe two, to cope with this potential threat here. Now, again, I think some people will say, well, you said we should trust Israel on this. They'll say, oh, Israel's trying to draw the UK into its war that it fooled Donald Trump into. But I think that's a very naive and foolish position, especially as you said, the actual fact is that only Israel and the United States are currently actually defending against the threat that we're talking about. They are the ones who are actually taking out the Iranian capabilities that we might be in danger from. And I think so we're getting it wrong on both fronts. We haven't got the capability to do this on our own, and we will rely on our allies to do it if it's needed. But actually, we're alienating them massively by the behavior, even just the rhetoric, not even the fact of denying them full access to what we could give, but also the fact that we're constantly wagging our finger at them as if they're doing something wrong. And I think that's very problematic. And when you mentioned shelters, actually, I was interested to think about that because, all of the people here probably have got some familiarity with Israel's capabilities with shelters. Individual homes have within them mamads, if they're modern enough, the safe room in the basement. New buildings have got other facilities. If there's no facilities in older buildings, then there's the possibility that there are local shelters in the neighborhoods which are for people to use. If not, the population is well trained. They share each other's facilities. Neighbours come and use shelters when needed. And as you mentioned, the London Underground, they've built the light rail in Tel Aviv. During the last war with Iran, the 12-day war, I found myself in a spectacular underground station in Tel Aviv, which had clearly been built with that in mind. It was very deep, it was very clean, very air conditioned, and it was built to double up as a public air raid shelter. So I don't think we have any of those things anymore. And I think most of the public shelters we had have been, since the Cold War period, have fallen into disrepair or been sold. People don't have individual shelters anymore, as some used to, the ones you used to find in gardens and things. I think we appear to have got it wrong on every level. We have no defence personally in our homes, no shelters. We have inadequate defence from the armed forces because of the lack of resources to them. And we've alienated our allies who we can hope to defend us if we need that help. And we've said we disapprove of the war they're engaging in far away, which could deal with the threat itself and make all of this unnecessary. It's rather confusing that that's what's happened. But I think I drew the comparison with the COVID pandemic. When that came round, we understood that successive governments have been spectacularly bad at forward planning for disaster scenarios. And so we all read about these pandemic preparations that were meant to have taken place for decades. And actually, when it came to it, they'd been allowed to slip. Nothing was really in place. They didn't even have masks for doctors in the beginning. And it seems like the same thing all over again. It's the easiest thing to save money on, is the looming threat that everyone can be told is never really going to happen. And it just seems like the perfect mess for somebody to decide to strike the UK. So I wonder if you can tell me from a military perspective, yes, they may have the capability, but do you think there's any realistic threat genuinely, even with that capability? I mean, would Iran do that? Should we be afraid of Russia? What are the imminent threats that we actually should say, well, you know what, you should have these things ready because of X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think the potential for Iran to do serious damage to the UK is diminishing by the day as Israel and the United States very, very impressively degrades their capabilities. Yes, they can hit quite effectively. In some cases, they can hit countries in the Middle East, including Israel. again, hopefully that will be gone. That whole threat will be gone in a matter of perhaps days or weeks. That doesn't mean to say it won't arise again, depending on whether the regime is changed or not. But I think we should take seriously the potential that Iran still has the capability of hitting the UK at the moment, even though our supposed allies, Israel and America, are taking care of it for us. As to other threats, Russia certainly has the capability of striking, I'd say, any European capital it chooses to. We've seen a lot of threats from Vladimir Putin since the Ukraine war began. We've seen him threatening nuclear attacks, and he hasn't specified against the West, but by implication he means against the West as well. Although, of course, we haven't seen him actually carrying any of that out, and we probably won't see him carrying that out. And I say probably, but the British government can't use hope as a strategy against a potential threat. So I think there's that. And that could, depending on how the war in Ukraine unfolds further, depending on other geopolitical events, we certainly should be ready for an attack from Russia by either missiles or drones, and China, of course, as well, is a potential foe, and we might be engaged, or certainly the United States, who we're very closely associated with, might be engaged in a hot conflict with China in the near future. We don't know that. And on top of all that, that we've got so many different countries and entities around the world in which drones are proliferating. So it may be more realistic to think of drone attacks as more likely than ballistic missile attacks. And you might say, well, drones, they generally have a fairly limited payload, not necessarily the case for particularly for Russia and China. And it's not a huge threat, but drones can be operated in swarms, which, even if you've got effective air defenses, as we've seen in Ukraine, some of them get through. So the threat is there and growing. I would say it's only going to grow, both from ballistic missiles and from drones. And this has been the case for many years now. It's not just suddenly sprung up because Iran started firing missiles. It's been the case for many, many years. And our government hasn't done, as far as I can see, haven't done anything effective about it. I'm not saying that they're doing nothing, but they're not doing anything that has produced really effective defenses. One thing I would add is that before I do add what I was going to finally say, I'll semi-finally say, when we think about all this, we should, when we listen to what our Prime Minister and our politicians in the Labour Party in particular are saying about this war that's going on now, US and Israel against Iran, it's in defense of us. Yes, of course, it's in defense of Israel and the Middle East, but it's also in defense of us. This whole thing is all about predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly about the Iranian nuclear program and their long-range ballistic missile program. And those two things combined, you would only need one nuclear-armed ballistic missile to get through into Europe, and you would have a catastrophe on your hands. And that's what America and Israel is stopping. But we can't seem to. Well, I don't think we don't see that. I think we do see that. But the priority, as I've said before, for the government is to appease the domestic supporters of the Labour Party. So they're really putting party politics above national defence, in my opinion. And I can't remember what the final thing I was going to say was. So I'll leave it.
I'm sure that will come back to in a moment. So yeah. I'll jump in and say actually that I wonder if you mentioned, the possibility of drone strikes and swarms of drones. I mean, these things, I think, to people of a certain age and under, and certainly I count myself in that category. But we're lucky, I suppose. We grew up in this era in the UK of no actual wars here, and it seems such an alien concept that I think for those of us who do spend time in places where this stuff happens, it doesn't seem far-fetched. But to people who grew up in Britain, I don't know, age 50 and under, it just seems like an impossibility that what happens in Israel could happen here. Just the same as it seems an impossibility to them that there could be a Muslim Brotherhood infiltration and takeover here, as happened in other countries, which were, predominantly Christian and then were forced into Islamist tyrannies, whether it is the Islamic Republic of Iran or whether it's Egypt or whether it's Lebanon. When even people from those countries come here and tell us, watch out, I recognize the same thing happening, I think the natural instinct for many citizens, never mind politicians, is to say that's not a thing that happens in Britain. The same seems to be the case of the idea of missiles. The idea of missiles being launched to us and landing in our streets, to most people I speak to, it's completely far-fetched. But of course, if you've spent any time in Israel, it's not far-fetched. And this is a first world, in some respects, country, and they have, you go about your everyday life in Israel and then you run into a bomb shelter and then you come out of the bomb shelter and carry on with your everyday life. I cannot imagine Britain doing this. In fact, I wonder if we did have these drone strikes, if we'd instead have the government or the mayor of London encouraging us to have a rally in Trafalgar Square, not to pray to Allah, but actually to have their drones can't divide us. Don't look back in anger. Our love's stronger than their missiles. I mean, this seems to me to be the British response these days. And so when we're talking about whether we're proud to be British in our response to all this, it's very hard to be proud of what this government and even previous governments have done to us in terms of our, not just defences and alliances, but our ethos. They've turned us, it would seem, into a nation of ostriches, just burying our head in the sand, saying can't happen here, because we love diversity.
I think you're absolutely right, and I would emphasise the point you made, that it's not just this government. I know this government's got many faults, but the Conservative Party and also a coalition of the Conservative and Liberal Democrat Party, whatever they were called, during one period of government, they were really just as bad in burying their head in the sand, and not just against the kind of the direct missile drone type threat we're talking about now, but against all threats to our national security. And that includes terrorist threats, which we've seen too much of in the UK. And we're going to see more of in the UK, without a shadow of a doubt. And instead of working to really suppress this by ensuring that those people who threaten terrorist attacks or carry out terrorist attacks receive an extremely harsh sentence, and that the people behind them and other people who are involved in jihadism in the UK are also harshly dealt with and suppressed rather than encouraged. But our response is to encourage it. And even such things as you mentioned, you sort of lightly mentioned the prayer service in Trafalgar Square to celebrate Eid. That sort of thing is something that we should be taking warning from. Now, I'm not branding all Muslims as being jihadist by any means, but that demonstration was a sign of Islamic supremacy, and we are happy to allow this to go on. We're happy to, we even encourage it. We don't do anything to suppress. I'm not saying suppressing Islam completely. Certainly, I'm saying suppress the political elements of Islam, but we should certainly suppress these shows as far as we can, these shows of Islamic supremacy, because it all leads to, in my opinion, it all ultimately leads to an increased threat of jihadist terrorist in the UK. And instead again, I emphasize, it's not just this government, it's all governments for as long as I can remember, certainly. So since 9/11, I suppose, when the threat became more real. And we, our response to things like the Manchester Arena outrage was, don't look back in anger.
Yeah.
That's the definition almost of the ostrich burying its head in the sand, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I remember interviewing you there. I was covering it for I-24, the Israeli channel, and those were my earlier days of TV reporting on these sorts of terror attacks, and I followed all these various ones around Europe for them. And it was fascinating to me because it's an Israeli channel, so they were watching the spread of Islamic jihadist terror attacks around Europe and the UK that they'd been experiencing for years. And I kept getting these questions from my producers saying, could you ask people when you interview them, do they understand Israel a bit better now? And I felt a little bit like this was a very insensitive question maybe to ask people who just suffered a terror attack. But, I took my orders and I went around and did it. And the answer was literally, without any hesitation, no, we don't. Without putting it quite so bluntly, their point was they deserve it. And so it does seem that we've learned no lessons from not just our allies or other countries who've experienced these things earlier than us, but even from our own experience of it. I don't think that we have any more robust an attitude towards the spread of jihadism in the UK now than we did before that Ariana Grande concert, or before London Bridge, or before David Amos's killing, or before 7/7 tube attacks, or all of the others. I think, in fact, it seems like we've just buried the head further and further into the ground as these things have happened, until the point at which many of us wonder if there's any way back. So I wonder now if I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, because I'm quite a pessimist about this. How can we deal with all of these? Not just the attitude. We discussed earlier the lack of military preparedness, but you can't just magic up a military after a decade plus of neglect. You can't just magic up hardware. You can't magic up personnel. Investment, you might be able to. You can't magic up a national attitude that is different. You can't create a population that's going to sign up and serve. Young people like in Israel who have had to do this forever as a piece of national service. It's like going to the gym. If you're overweight, you can't just turn up at the gym and expect to look better next week. You have to have started sometime before. But the threat is now. We can't even build shelters. This is what you said. Maybe we can mobilize the London Underground. What about the rest of the UK? What about the parts of London that don't have something nearby? What can we actually do now if tomorrow we had a government of any colour or stripe that said, well, we've identified this problem. It was a big mistake how we've dealt with this. We now, the clock's ticking. We're at 5 minutes to 12. What would your advice be to them that we can get done in time?
Well, I think it's the same. I mean, there's two elements to it, I think, Jonathan. One is it's the same answer as to every other major problem we have, which is we need money, and the money's not there. So to actually, you're absolutely right. You can't just build up a hugely neglected defence system overnight. And when you add to the neglect of our defences over so many years, the fact that we've also diverted a huge amount of our capabilities to Ukraine to help Ukraine fight against the Russians, we're in an even more powerless state. So that, a lot of money is required quickly in order to repair this. But that of course, that money's got to come from somewhere else. And where else is it going to come from? Well, we've got a vast welfare budget, and we've got obviously a vast health budget and an education budget. And those are the three, I think I'm right in saying those are probably the three main areas of spending. And so you've got to rob one or more of those of the money. And it's not an easy. There's not an easy solution to it. I would say one thing is one of the major focuses should be on doing something really serious about the welfare budget. And let's not forget that in the future we're going to have. I don't know what the percentages are, you probably do, but we've got a huge number of people out of work now, not because there aren't jobs, but because they don't want to do those jobs for one reason or another. And in some cases, of course, they simply can't do it if they're disabled or something, which is a different issue. But we're coming very, very fast, and I'm not in any way an expert on anything technical at all. Quite the opposite. I'm surprised this Zoom conference actually worked with me on one end of the camera. Normally I would break everything. But we've got AI coming up very, very fast on us, and we've got robotics coming up very, very fast on us. And that means a lot more people aren't going to have jobs, and the welfare budget is going to be increased even more. So that makes the problem even more difficult. And I know you asked me how to fix it, and I don't know, but I do know that pushing more money into defence, not just saying we are, which we've been doing for too long, is one side. The other is our national mentality, because you can't expect young people to sign up to defend their country if their country is constantly being, and the indigenous population of the country in particular, is constantly being downgraded and told that we've got a terrible past, we're a terrible culture, the white male toxicity and all this sort of stuff. Now, how do you then expect those people to willingly sign up to defend their country? So it has to start with that as well. And I think another element that we need to think about is dealing with the rising threat of Islamic Jihad. And that the reason we both, I think, agreed earlier that the government would rather shove its head into the sand than actually deal with this problem. And the reason for that is because I don't underestimate I don't underestimate all politicians, shall we say. I'm sure the Prime Minister, most of the cabinet, and other people are well aware of this problem and the dangers we're getting into increasingly, but they're unwilling to tackle it because they know that any robust action against this situation is going to cause trouble for them. It's going to cause trouble on the streets of Britain for them. They don't want that. They would rather kick the can down the road and let the next government in 5 years' time or 3 years' time, whatever it is, deal with a problem that's just got worse and worse and worse. And unfortunately, it's storing up huge amount of danger for this country as the situation is allowed to deteriorate more and more.
On which happy note, I'm being asked to switch us to the Q&A to get other people's questions. So I, like you, am not willing to drive such a thing technically, but I believe Steve is going to take over from here.
I am indeed. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. And considering the time, and it's Sunday evening, and we still want you to have some semblance of an evening after this, we will go straight to the questions. So, David, Lazarus, if you could unmute yourself and also put your video on. David? Oh, okay, well, David's gone. Barry, can you unmute yourself, please? Barry? Barry, are you able to unmute yourself? No? Okay, Roger, how about you?
Hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Okay, Barry, yes, back to you, Barry. We can hear you now.
Thank
Okay,
you.
if you'd like to put your question to either of Richard or Jonathan.
It's to Richard because Jonathan has disclosed to us this evening he's far too young. You can probably tell by my voice I'm a World War II veteran. Not fighting in it, but bombed in it. and it wasn't a very nice experience. And when I went to Washington many years ago and visited one of the museums there, when the Beetle was out of the way, I had the good opportunity of whacking a V2 rocket with my walking stick. Richard and I have met before at the House of Commons when We Believe in Israel was launched, and Richard, you very kindly gave me your brochure. My question is, and I have many, what you said this evening is horrifying, because you disclosed to us a major breach of the UK Constitution perpetrated by our incumbent Prime Minister. The role of every Prime Minister, as it is indirectly by the head of state, is to defend the realm. That becomes above any other consideration.
Barry, if you could get to the question, because we do have quite a few others who would like
Yes,
to
the
ask.
question is, it
Thank
has
you.
been said recently that Keir Starmer is no Churchill. He's also no Clement Attlee. Would you please like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, before I do, I'd just like to express my outrage at your suggestion that when you excluded Jonathan from this answer, that I must have been around during the Second World War.
No, you weren't. You weren't, Colonel Kemp. I'm sorry.
I know I'm extremely old, but I'm not quite that old yet. My father was, and my mother was, and I remember my mother telling me about her experience on the wrong.
Wasn't very nice.
No, and she was on the wrong end of the odd V1 drone attack, as we call it today. I would add to your. I mean, I think Trump is absolutely right. Keir Starmer is no Churchill, and he's certainly, nor is he a Clement Attlee, but also he's not a Neville Chamberlain. He's not even a Neville Chamberlain. And yes, we often vilify Neville Chamberlain for appeasing the Nazis, but I think Neville Chamberlain did that. I'm not saying that he did the right thing entirely, but he did that in the knowledge that Britain was in a pretty similar situation then to what it is now, and the Nazis were rising. In other words, we lacked military capability, and I think he felt that by giving time and putting maximum effort into building up our capability, which he did, was probably the right approach. That was what he thought. Now, I don't think that's in the mind of Keir Starmer at the moment. So I think he's more of a kind of lost figure. So I don't think he's even a Neville Chamberlain. But I've said this a couple of times, and I think Jonathan's agreed with me as well, that it's not just this government. I would say it's all British governments since Margaret Thatcher, who actually was willing to stand up for what she thought was right, was willing to defend this country, and stuck her neck out on at least two major occasions to ensure that happened, not including her activities in Northern Ireland, which were also pretty robust. So yeah, I can't really add much to that except to say I agree with Trump and I agree with you.
Steve.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Steve?
Okay, David, yeah, we can hear you. So would you like to take the question over?
Yeah. So you two distinguished guys used to appear a lot on the British TV news, and was very interesting to hear your take on the matters, putting context into what's going on. Is there any reason why we don't see you on British mainstream news anymore? Do you have feelings that they've taken the audience down the wrong path?
I can speak for myself only. I can't speak for Jonathan. I'm sure he will do. But I used to be fairly prolific on BBC, ITV, Sky, Channel 4, etc. When I was talking about Iraq and Afghanistan during those campaigns. When I first began to comment on the situation in Israel which was at the time of the 2008 war with Gaza, Operation Cast Lead, then I was kind of cancelled, shall we say. Not entirely, because I'm still occasionally asked to speak on the BBC and other news channels, but not about Israel. Very, very rarely about Israel, because it's very hard for them. I sympathise with the BBC, as a matter of fact. The BBC's agenda is very, very clearly anti-Israel. There's no question about that. Whatever they might say, that is the reality. And it's very hard for them to wheel out somebody who they present as a defense expert or something, whatever they call me and others, if that person is going against their agenda. Because, that, how can I be an expert? How can I be a realistic expert if I don't agree with them? So they don't really have me very much, certainly not about Israel. And I'll just say one final thing on that, and the same applies to the other major channels. GB News obviously is an exception, Talk TV is an exception, or Talk, whatever it's called nowadays, and a few other broadcast media, some in the US and Australia, etc. Particularly notably, I'd say Sky News Australia, which is totally different from Sky News UK. But just the final comment on that is that one of the last times I spoke to the BBC, did an interview with the BBC about the war in Israel several years ago now, the only way they could get around this problem they had of a so-called defense expert disagreeing with them was by accusing me of being Jewish. Because that meant, of course, I was obviously lying if I was Jewish, if I was talking about Israel. So that was their sort of last resort.
Very interesting.
Well, if I can say my experience, is not dissimilar. The BBC used to invite me, and Sky News actually, Sky News even more, used to invite me relatively regularly. On my part, it was usually to discuss Israel, actually. And what I would say they used to do on the BBC, I used to describe it as holding their nose and calling me up, because they felt I got told this by one producer there. I get accused of being one-sided whenever we cover Israel, so I'm calling you because I understand that you are pro-Israel. And I would always say to those people, it's not so much that I'm pro-Israel. I said I try to be balanced, but from your angle, your perspective, that obviously looks strangely pro-Israel, because I believe you have a quite a skewed view of these things. But they said, well, that'll do. Come in. I'll tell you, I pretty much have a date in my diary when those calls stopped. It was the 7th of October, 2023. I didn't receive a single call from the BBC to talk about Israel since that day. Now, I can't say that there's a conspiracy that they, the whole of the BBC got together to decide they weren't inviting Jonathan Sacerdoti in again. But it is too suspicious in my mind that I and many other people who used to fulfill that remit on the channel stopped getting calls. And Sky News invited me a little bit towards the beginning of the war, and then also completely stopped. What I'll say about Talk and GB News is this. At the beginning of those channels' existence in this country, many people lamented the fact that we were starting to have what they called right-wing channels, like America, where they have Fox News and Newsmax and things like that. And I could understand that they felt that way, that we had this tradition of impartiality. But I think that the channels which we already had for so long, especially the BBC, but Sky is quite dreadful as well, in my opinion, in terms of bias on this topic anyway. They completely disgraced themselves in terms of impartiality. They are not impartial. And so when those so-called right-wing channels did launch, I must say they proved their importance and value from October the 7th onwards. I got to go on GB News and Talk many, many times since then, and I appear on those regularly. And they are the only places where in all of my career I've been able to do things like read out extracts from the Hamas Charter, which explained during the beginning stages of, for example, the October 7th war, what Hamas really stood for. Many people watching didn't know what Hamas was, and I felt it was my responsibility to highlight the overt anti-Semitism in their founding charter. Now, I know for a fact that if I'd ever tried to do that on the BBC, I wouldn't just have been blacklisted from future appearances. I would have been frog-marched out of the studio live on air. But on GB News, I was given that opportunity. And in fact, because of their Ofcom obligations to add contrast, I found myself in the peculiar circumstance that the host, a certain Nigel Farage, had to put the opposite case to me. So there I was arguing with Nigel Farage over whether Hamas was an anti-Semitic ideological jihadist organization. But so thank goodness for those channels, in the sense that, you know, they're putting left-wingers on and they're putting right-wingers on. And I'm not sure being pro-Israel should be seen as either of those per se. But that is the answer. And also, I can't go without saying a massive vote of thanks to The Spectator, for whom I write daily. I mean, I've been writing a daily update on the war since it started on The Spectator. It is now shifting over just to my Substack, if anyone's interested in watching it. But reading it, that is important. And I've written countless articles for them analysing what's going on in the Middle East, and they are absolutely wonderful in allowing me to write the analysis as I see things. So there are media outlets which are giving better and more balanced and fairer perspectives. Unfortunately, the BBC still has something of a stranglehold.
Can I just add something to that, Jonathan? I think I agree with you totally that Sky is every bit as biased as the BBC, and possibly even more so. I'm not so concerned about that, because they're not a taxpayer-funded organisation. I'm very concerned about the BBC. I'm not desperate to get on the BBC. I don't care whether I'm on it or not. But I do think that, as most of us here probably fund the BBC, we should expect to have balance in these discussions. But I would say I can confirm there is a conspiracy in the BBC, because from time to time, I mean, I've done one or two interviews during this war, the 2 years of this war, on the BBC, but several times over a number of years since I was pretty much cancelled by the BBC, several times I would get a phone call or a message from probably a new producer in the BBC who had caught my name somewhere, thought I'd be someone who'd be a good candidate for an interview, and asked me if I could do it. And I said, yes, I can do it. And I know each time that happens, it happens fairly frequently. Each time that happens, I know they're going to get back to me an hour or two later and say, oh, we've had to rearrange our schedule and you're no longer going to be there. Sorry to waste your time. Knowing full well that my name has come up on their computer system, and someone within the editorial area of the BBC, someone probably in the Middle East area particularly, has said, no, we're not having that idiot.
Their loss.
Interesting. Yeah, indeed. As Jonathan said, their loss. Roger, you've had your hand up, so can you unmute yourself? Roger, can you unmute? No. Roger, we'll come back to you in a moment. Vicky Bogle, can you please unmute yourself? Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
There. It's actually my other half, Albert, who wants to ask a question.
Hi there. Yeah, I was just wondering what the reasons you see why Keir Starmer has taken the stance he has over October the 7th, before and after, and with everything that's happened. Why does he seem to be on the side of the Islamists? Is it just because of Labour votes? And I take the point that you said that he doesn't want war on the streets and a revolution. Yes, I can see that. But I'd like you to comment on whether there's a political side of it with Labour votes that he's trying to secure.
Yeah, I've spoken about that. Maybe Jonathan would like to put his perspective.
I will say I agree with pretty much everything Richard said, but I would add also that I do think it's quite difficult. I often get asked what I think is the root cause of anti-Semitism, and I always say I'm not a psychologist. I can't diagnose insanity, but I sort of feel the same answer might apply here, but not insanity. I think Keir Starmer, to my mind, is a politician who it's very hard to detect any true fixed position on anything in. So I think there are so many things that it's hard to detect what he really believes. I think he's kind of proving himself to be the definition of a politician who will bend and change with what he sees as the expedient thing to do in order to pursue both his survival in the party and the party's survival in the country to be in government. I think, unfortunately for him, it has the actual opposite effect because he ends up alienating everybody in that respect. So I don't think that the portion of the Labour Party and the electorate that he hoped to satisfy by throwing Israel under the bus was satisfied by it. They still consider him to be what they would call complicit with genocide, etc., etc. And certainly, I think anybody that cares about Israel and the just nature of the war that it has been engaged in and the current American-Israeli joint action in Iran and all of those things, well, they're not particularly satisfied by this fence sitting and then sort of gradual U-turning of saying, well, you can make some defensive strikes from Diego Garcia and what have you. I don't think it's satisfied anyone. So I would say that it's very hard to understand what motivates him in this regard. Sometimes I think it is genuine, heartfelt dislike of Israel and the concerns of the Jewish community. And other times I think, no, it's what he thinks is politically sensible and he's wrong. For his own benefit as well. Whichever one it is, it's like I say with the anti-Semitism question, it almost doesn't matter because we come out of it badly. So it's hard to know what to say about all that other than I don't really know what's going on there, but it looks like a disaster whichever side you're on.
I mean, Richard, do you have something to add to that? Because I don't know what you've said in the past. Sorry, I've missed that. Because it seems like it's also tied in with the Muslim rape gangs that's been covered up and just dragging on and on and on and doesn't get sorted.
Yeah,
so I'm wondering.
I agree with everything Jonathan just said, and I did make the point earlier that my view is that Starmer's approach to Israel, including this war that's going on now with Iran and the US, is driven mainly by his desperation to maintain the support of an alliance of radical left and Islamist supporters who proliferate in Labour. Unfortunately for him, as Jonathan kind of suggests, I think he doesn't go far enough, and it's not really working. And you know, we saw in the recent by-election how Labour got trounced by a party that was prepared to go further in its appeal to Islam even than Labour goes. And then you just have to look back across. I was going to say across the Atlantic, but across the other side of the world. You look at the reception that the Prime Minister of Australia got in a mosque in Sydney recently, when he was really treated extremely badly, booed and verbally insulted or assaulted verbally by some of the congregants of the mosque. And that is the Prime Minister who has probably gone at least as far, possibly even further, than Keir Starmer in attempting to appease the Islamic community in Australia, but by being aggressive and offensive towards Israel, and you know, so I think that probably demonstrates the point Jonathan made, that it will never be enough.
Yeah, I think Dan Shiftan put it well to me when he said, what do you do with a hungry crocodile? It's not give it a banana.
Do crocodiles eat bananas?
Well, I'm not sure.
The veggie ones do. Okay, well, thank you for that. Roger, you're unmuted, I see.
Yes, I'd like to, if this is the last question, try to finish on an upbeat note.
Well, there's a couple of other people we have.
Oh, okay.
Got their hands up. Do you want to? Shall I come back to you, Roger?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'd like to be a bit upbeat. So I'm thinking, what is Reform going to do about all this if and when they take over running the country? Is it too late for them to undo the damage that's been done by Labour? is there something coming at the end of the rainbow which might benefit the country and make it more popular with our other countries that rely on us? And is there something that he can actually do? Has he got the money to do it? Will he have the money?
Well, I think it's a big if he gets into power. But then, of course, no one can predict any election with any certainty. But and I'd just like to pick you up on the point you made about the damage Labour's done. And I've said this a couple of times. It's not just Labour. It's all governments in recent years, Conservative, Labour, Liberal, Democrat, have been complicit in this and have allowed this situation to deteriorate further and further. I think I think if Nigel Farage gets to be Prime Minister and wants to make radical change, if he actually does want to do that, I don't know whether he does or not, then he's going to face a massive problem. He's not just going to face a massive problem from the consequences of trying to radically reform this country, particularly its problem with jihadism and Islamic supremacy, which is growing in this country. There will be huge fallout from that. But he's going to face probably an even bigger problem, or at least as big a problem, which is what some people call the deep state. And I mean by that the civil service, the all-powerful civil service, the judiciary, the media, and the other elements, including the police as well now, that most of which would be opposed, I think, to any radical reform he might carry out. So I know you wanted to introduce a note of optimism, and I don't want to cast a dark cloud on that, but I do think it's a hell of a situation that we've got ourselves into now, and it's getting worse and worse. And I'm not optimistic that Keir Starmer or anyone else can really resolve it. And I particularly emphasise the civil service. The civil service is completely different from what it was decades ago. It's now it no longer. And I don't brand all civil servants like this, but the civil service as a kind of general body is not on the side of reform of these issues. They're woke. They've been indoctrinated mainly at universities, but also elsewhere, and they would work again. Doesn't matter whether the government's democratic elected by a massive majority. The civil service is massively powerful, and that would be the first thing that he would have to do. I think would be to reform the civil service, which itself would be a huge problem. I don't know if you agree with that, Jonathan, or not.
I agree with pretty much all of that, and the bit that you said at the beginning, I would just elaborate on as quickly as possible because I know there are others who want to ask questions. But I would say that it's a big if Nigel Farage is able to win, and I will personally say that I'm not altogether convinced that it will be the miracle many people are hoping for. Not necessarily because I have anything particular against him or anyone else more than other politicians, but just to say that, it is, at the end of the day, a completely untested party, which has no real history, made up of people who are, let's say, unusual characters and rejects from the Tory party increasingly. And I'm not trying to be totally scathing or pessimistic about any of this, but just to say it's not he's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy, as they say in The Life of Brian. Just because he says all the right things to some people doesn't mean he has all the right answers or all the right abilities. And to win a majority and make a strong government with mostly completely unknown people who have no experience could go one of two ways. One is it could be amazing. It could be the disruption that's needed, like in tech companies where new people come along with brilliant ideas and move quickly and break things. Or it could be the opposite, which is that they just have no idea how things work. And despite the few defections from other parties, which give a little bit of parliamentary experience to the party, it could just be that they just don't know what to do, and that fits in with the civil service issue and with all of it actually. So I am afraid that I'm not naturally very optimistic about any of this. The note of optimism I tend to add is, well, we've got to keep trying. And I think actually the biggest change that we need, whoever wins power, is a cultural change. One where we learn to be proud of Britishness again, and proud of our British values and our Western values, proud of who we are. And that involves being certain of who we are. And that involves also opposition to who we are not, and the people that challenge those values and cultures that we should rebuild a pride in. That will start for me. The civil service is important, but it will start for me at schools and at universities. And that is a generational project. I'm not sure if we've got time, but I think that that seems the most obvious place to do it, because if you introduce, let's say, national service, an idea I think is probably ripe and good, nobody would do it in this nation, probably understandably, unless you trained them from childhood, as they do, for example, in Israel, that this is a virtuous thing to do for your nation, that your nation has a clear identity that needs defending against a clear enemy that is defined and visible and obvious. And so if you have a proud culture, you have a need for such a thing, and you manage to educate your population to fall in line with that, then I think you stand a chance. And it doesn't really matter what colour the rosettes are of those in power, because if they can do that, and I would say that the Shabana Mahmood has kind of tried to make the right noises about a lot of the issues for the Labour Party. It's just very difficult to believe her when only a few years ago I saw her boycotting Sainsbury's or whatever it was and waving Free Palestine banners and what have you. So I'm not optimistic, but I do think there is a route out of this. It's just probably a very unlikely one to succeed. And I, like many of you watching, it's a Jewish crowd, are considering, I think many of us are considering our options, let's say, which is heartbreaking because we're Brits.
Indeed, indeed it is. Catherine Bowles, could you unmute yourself, please? Catherine?
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Catherine's husband here. Hi there. This question is probably more for Richard. If regime change in Iran is one of America and Israel's aims, do you think it's possible just by air attack, or are boots on the ground needed?
I think regime changes. I think Trump and Netanyahu both specified regime change not as being a primary military objective, and essentially the military objectives of this war are to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, to prevent Iran from having ballistic missiles capable of damaging or destroying elements of the countries in the region and elsewhere, and thirdly, of preventing Iran from maintaining and developing its proxy network. Those are the three pretty much specified objectives. And I think both of the leaders, Netanyahu and Trump, have said that regime change would be a very welcome byproduct of that. And I think that's true, because if all of those three objectives are achieved and the regime remains in place, then that regime is going to develop them again. It's going to go back to the drawing board and start again somehow, probably with the support of Russia and China. So regime change is a highly desirable outcome of this. And that, I haven't even spoken about the oppression of their own people by the Iranian regime and the mass murders they've been carrying out, which are obviously important as well. I don't think there's any real prospects of US or Israeli boots on the ground in mainland Iran. I think it's possible, and it's been mooted, that there might be a ground attack on Karg Island, their main oil export infrastructure, which could see US forces on the ground there potentially. But that would be a very limited deployment. And also, I've no doubt there are currently Israeli, possibly US special forces already in Iran doing various things, and whether it's to do with direct attacks against or focusing the direct attacks against the Iranian regime, or whether it's supporting and trying to coordinate the oppositionists in Iran. I don't know that for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me. But beyond that, I think it's got to be really up to the population of Iran to change that regime. And the population as a whole doesn't really have the ability to do that. Certain elements within the population perhaps do. And I think probably one of the options for bringing about regime change would be the Iranian army, not the IRGC, but the Iranian army, which is, I think its loyalty to the regime is, in many parts of it, is at best questionable. It's possible that they could stage a military coup and bring down this regime, probably with the assistance of the US and Israel. And secondly, the Kurdish forces in Iraq, which have been, as people know, have been on the border with Iran, and there's been speculation about whether they'll come in. I think that that in some respects that emphasizes the massive problems that are likely to be faced in the event of regime change, because Iran is not a kind of coherent country. It's got many different factions, many different ethnic elements within it, which will no doubt be at each other's throats as soon as they get the chance to do so. So I think I would say that the prospects of a clean regime change are very limited. I think the likelihood is much more that we're going to see either this regime continues in some form, or we see probably a very bloody and violent period of struggle within Iran, which could be extended over a long period of time. But I think probably, I don't like to say, well, this is how it worked in Iraq or Afghanistan, and therefore it's going to work like that here, because every situation is totally different. But I do think the boots on the ground, as you put it, adequate to bring about regime change is going to be dragging not the banana into the jaws of the alligator or whatever it was, but dragging the American arm into a mangle for a long period of time. So I don't think that's real. I could be wrong. I mean, no one can really predict how any war is going to work out, particularly when President Trump is at the helm, which is a good thing from the perspective of our side versus the enemy side. But I don't see that happening.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Nick.
Thank you, Jonathan and Richard. Really, really fascinating. Can I just comment? Dominic Cummings was extremely complimentary about Danny Kruger, who he thought had the experience to influence the deep state should reform get in power. And for Jonathan, Michael Gove has, as I understand, is going to be defending the BBC licence fee at the Spectator debate, and I wonder if you could speak to him, because I think you're hopefully you would persuade his argument. But my question, Richard, do you think the priority, if the government was to come up with money for defence, would increasing the availability of the systems that we have, i.e., the getting the maintenance sorted out and the support, be the priority, or do our armed forces actually need some entirely new capabilities to be relevant to the current threat?
Jonathan, do you want to do the political bit first?
Well, I mean, in terms of Michael Gove and the BBC licence fee, I don't believe I have any sway over Michael Gove's opinions or what he will or won't do. I'm but a writer for a magazine he edits. Listen, we all disagree on various things in life. I think the BBC I think it's served its time and it should be dismantled, and I don't really see a place for it generally, even if it did work very well. I think we have so many commercial opportunities now to do almost everything it's meant to do. The only thing I will say about the BBC as quickly as I can is that, in my opinion, it would justify its license fee if it were actually brave enough to make programs that commercial broadcasters couldn't make, and that would be far more likely to be a program which is critical, say, of Hamas or Palestinianism, because if a commercial broadcaster were to make those, and there was a sort of groundswell of public opinion and protest and violent protest and what have you and disruption, it would influence their ability to do that, and a boycott of advertising and those sorts of things. Whereas a publicly funded broadcaster could do what would be virtuous thing of telling the truth, even if it is politically unfashionable or unfashionable with a noisy part of society. And that is the one thing it doesn't do. It actually falls in line with what its commercial rivals do. And it does that even in less contentious areas. It makes entertainment programs that look identical to the entertainment programs on commercial broadcasters. It is basically no longer a public service broadcaster taking risks for the benefit of better broadcasting. So it doesn't need to exist. That's my opinion. I know it's a sort of holy cow in our country, like the NHS and various other things. And that's because the idea is brilliant. But the result, in my opinion, is not brilliant. And I mean, I watch very little BBC outputs, if any, in my life, and I don't feel less enriched for it. So I'll stop there and hand over to Richard for the rest.
I think I'd on that point about the BBC, I agree it should be chucked in the bin, even though that is, in some respects, is a loss to the country. But I do think that the reason we've got the BBC in the condition it's in now goes back to the point you made earlier on, the fundamental point that's required in change here, which is education. All of these people are the product of radically left influenced high school and university education, all of them. And, you know, once we got rid of the BBC, maybe we should get rid of the universities as well, or at least radically reform them. But on the question about the British Armed Forces, I mean, defence today is in probably a more difficult position than it's ever been in. And I'm talking about defence in general, because there are two key elements about defence. There's lots of other stuff like procurement and supply and all the rest of it, which are important but secondary. The two key elements of defence really are what I would call hard combat power, and by that I mean tanks, artillery, battleships or destroyers and aircraft carriers, combat planes and all of that, all the hard infantry soldiers. That hard area of defence that's been with us since time immemorial. And the second element is the technical developments. We've always had technical developments since the invention of gunpowder, but now the technical developments are moving very, very fast and are very, very expensive. And there's got to therefore be a balance between what you rely on the technical side and what you rely on the hard combat side. And our government, not just this government, again, going back previous governments, have, I think, taken the wrong approach. They've taken this kind of bury your head in the sand approach in a way, and don't look back in anger approach by focusing far more on the technical stuff. And by technical, what I'm talking about, it's probably not the correct term, but what I mean is things like artificial intelligence, things like cyber war, computers, aerial surveillance, all of that sort of stuff, which is the kind of, it's a bit more fluffy than stuffing a bayonet into someone's guts, or throwing a hand grenade into their face. So it's more in tune with our kind of current way of thinking, and therefore it's had the priority. And I think it was Boris Johnson who said we're never going to see, when he signed off the cutting of significant amount of armoured regiments, we're never going to see armoured warfare in Europe again. Well, guess what happened a few years later in Ukraine? And so we need both. We need both sides. There's no question. And because we need both sides in significant volume, it's doubly expensive or quadruply expensive, what it is. So that's kind of my outlook on it. And I think we've seen that both in Israel and in Ukraine in the most recent major conflicts we've had, is that Israel and Ukraine depend, and Russia and Iran, they depend on a lot on technical capability, cyber, and all this sort of stuff. But they also, there's plenty of tanks been roaring around in Gaza, plenty of artillery being fired, plenty of infantry soldiers seizing and holding ground, certainly in Gaza and in Lebanon, if not in Iran, and certainly in Ukraine. So I think this is the problem we've got, which goes back to the point I made before, which is such an obvious point. I'm reluctant to make it again. We just need vastly more money in defence. And saying we're going to increase, we're at something like 2.5% of GDP is spent on defence today, or 2.3 or something, whatever it is. And Starmer said, yeah, we might increase to 4 in X years if we're, depending on the economic conditions. And that's not enough. 5% is not enough. We need to spend a lot more than that. And where's it coming from? That's the big question. But otherwise, we have to accept, as someone made the point earlier on, the government's first duty is to defend the country. Unless it's prepared to actually make harsh economic sacrifices in other areas, we're not going to get to that stage.
Okay, thank
I
you.
understand it. The reason we had the debacle about dispatching the warship was that to save money, they'd stood down the naval dockyard from 24 operation to 9 to 5. And our submarines, their availability is very low, again, because of the maintenance isn't being done. So even the things that on paper we have aren't available to the commanders should they wish to use them.
Absolutely.
Thank you. We're going to move on because we do have. Are you gentlemen okay to answer 2 more questions?
I am.
Jonathan?
2 more sounds good.
Okay, and then we'll call it an evening. Okay, so Michael Goldberg, can you please switch on your video?
It's okay. There we go. Okay. Hi, it's his wife, Sean.
Okay, you have a video or?
Yeah, just doing it now. Allowing it, sorry. Okay, I just have a question. All of my families, 95%, have served. How do you make conscription more attractive?
You don't need to make conscription attractive. You just
no,
law.
To the politicians to make it something that can be put in place.
Yeah.
Or the military more attractive, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, make the military more attractive, right? I think, I personally don't believe conscription is necessary. I do think it would be desirable in some respects, but our armed forces are, all elements of the armed forces, particularly the Army and the Navy, are very heavily undermanned. And that the undermanning in the Navy accounts for the problem that we've just been talking about of the unavailability of warships. But I don't believe that's the result of an unwillingness for people to serve. I do agree with what Jonathan said before, that it's necessary for people to have pride in their country and a patriotic spirit if you're going to get volunteers in the numbers that you need. But even without that radical change, I think there's a fundamental problem in the British Armed Forces, and that is the recruitment. Recruiting, even when I was serving, and that was many years ago, not back in the Second World War, as Barry suggested earlier, but back in the 90s, 2000s, we used to say that the recruiting organization in the Army, and I'm sure the same is true in the Navy as well, the recruiting organization exists to prevent people joining, because it's so complex, and it's all based on computers now. If you want to sign up, you can't just walk down your high street into a recruiting office and put your name on a bit of paper and talk to a real soldier about it. You've got to go through an impenetrable computer system, which will say if you've got a filling that needs doing, then come back when you had your filling done, or that sort of stupidities like that. And the whole process is so long-winded that a young man or woman of 17, 18 years of age who wants to serve their country and also wants a job, the process from signing up or trying to sign up to actually getting into the army and getting paid to serve is probably going to be around a year or so, sometimes more, maybe sometimes a bit less. But if a 17-year-old guy or 18-year-old guy or whatever wants a job, he wants it probably tomorrow or in a couple of weeks' time. He doesn't want to wait. And if he waits around for a year, he's going to get another job. Anyway, that's kind of a long-winded way of saying the recruiting system is badly screwed up and has been for many years. And it's mainly the result of starving the recruiting organization of funds, outsourcing it. Recruiting is now done by a civilian organization. And the first, if a young man or woman wants to join, say, the infantry and wants to know what it's like fighting, how am I going to feel when I get into a war? Am I going to be able to kill someone? How dangerous is it? All that sort of stuff, which are, perfectly reasonable questions that people would want to ask. They're going to be talking probably to a computer with a civilian on the other end of it who's never been in any kind of combat. Whereas in the past, you used to be able to walk into a recruiting office and talk to someone who's seen action or probably seen action. And that can be very encouraging for someone who's thinking about a career in the armed forces. So sorry, I've banged on about that a bit too long, but it is my hobby horse, and or one of my many hobby horses. But I think sorting out the recruiting system is fundamentally important to manning the armed forces to the extent we need to do. I think secondly, when you say how do you make it more attractive, you pay them more. And okay, most people don't necessarily join the army because they want to be millionaires, but the more you pay them, the more attractive it is. It's not just attractive to someone who's joining, it's also attractive to someone who's already serving and persuading them to stay, because that's one of the biggest problems is the number of people who are leaving because they don't consider themselves to be treated properly or paid fairly. So that's another dimension. And one point I would add as well, when I said I don't think conscription is really necessary, but it does have benefits, I think a lot of the potential benefits of conscription could be achieved by far more common membership of youth organizations like the Scouts, like the Service Cadets, etc. And in countries, I think Thailand, for example, I think it's mandatory to be in the Scouts or the Cadets while you're at school. And I think that kind of system, first of all, if it was run right, if the Scouts were not too woke and the Cadets weren't too woke, then it could help part of this issue of instilling pride and national spirit into young people and self-reliance and to an extent discipline as well. I think that's something that it's going to cost something, but it's not going to cost a vast amount, I don't think. And that's something you should be focused on as well. And I was very pleased to find out, I think about 3-4 years ago, that a school that many of you will be familiar with, the Jewish Free School in London, formed its own combined cadet force or army cadet force, which is highly commendable, I think, and not enough schools are doing that.
You've got a secondary problem at the moment, just to finish off. Keir Starmer, in his last comment, of course, was saying that British troops would be happy to find out that they would be legally on the right side whenever they went to combat, which we laughed at. But the other thing is that he's now been, a lot of the people in the special forces that we know are thinking of leaving, given the legal dangers they are in when they are going out and doing what they've been ordered to do.
That's another very good point. Yeah, I could go on for hours on that, but I won't because I know we're short of time. But it is, I mean, I think this government, not just this government and previous governments in Britain, they're the only government that I know of in the world ever that has deliberately and enthusiastically sought the prosecution and the pursuit through the courts and through various inquiries of its own soldiers. Yes, of course, if a soldier commits a crime, whether it's civilian crime or a war crime or whatever, then of course it needs to be investigated and dealt with. But this has gone much further than that. We've seen old men pursued over things that they were cleared of half a century ago in Northern Ireland, still being dragged into the courts now. That's got to be a very negative issue as far as recruiting and particularly retention is concerned.
Okay, thank you. So I've just been in touch with Jonathan, or Jonathan has been in touch with me, and Jonathan does need to go. He has another interview very shortly, which he just needs to prepare for. So, Jonathan, thank you very much. We will be doing a vote of thanks towards the end, but thank you very much for joining us.
Many thanks to you, and apologies for ducking out. But
not
after this, if you haven't had enough of me, you can tune into I-24 and you'll see what I left for. So, thank you again.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
All the best.
I also add my thanks to Jonathan. It's this is not the first time I've been interrogated by him. He's a very talented interrogator, but I also have been trained at resistance to interrogation. But Jonathan, it's been a real pleasure.
Thanks. Likewise.
Can I just share one thought with you at a second? The BBC gets this big chunk of its non-licensed revenue from advertising and programming in the Middle East. So the Middle East has a major impact on the BBC's funding.
Okay, thanks, Lawrence. Okay, so our final. So thank you, Jonathan. Good night, and good luck with the interview. Thank you. So one last question, and hopefully it's directed at you, Richard, is from Michael Sampson. Michael, you've unmuted yourself.
Yes, hello. Thank you for a very interesting evening. Just wanted to ask, the government have not proscribed the IRGC or Muslim Brotherhood. Secondly, they are still, I understand, paying funding to UNRWA, and we're not sure how that's been used, probably against Israel effectively. And thirdly, the recognition of Palestine, I think, is really a very difficult situation for us on this when they have not any authority to do that at all, legally, I think. Just want any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely in favour of prescribing the IRGC and the Muslim Brotherhood, which certainly many Arab countries have prescribed the Muslim Brotherhood for the reasons that we should be prescribing them, because they endanger national security. And even other European countries have, the EU as a whole, I think, has prescribed the IRGC, and many Arab countries or many other countries around the world have prescribed the IRGC. We certainly should have done that. When I was working in the Joint Intelligence Committee in the Prime Minister's office, this is going back to the early to mid 2000s, it was very obvious then, and I was dealing with intelligence relating to international terrorism, including IRGC activities. It was very obvious then that they should have been prescribed back then. And certainly things have developed even further since those days, and they should be out in their ear. They should be prescribed, and we should not tolerate an entity that not only so severely murders and suppresses its own people, but also represents a direct and clear threat to the UK. We've heard of a number of, from the government itself, we've heard of a number of Iranian terrorist plots, some of which have been through Hezbollah, in the UK I'm talking about. And I believe I'm right in saying Hezbollah attempted to set up a bomb-making factory in the UK a few years back, which was disrupted by British security services on the basis of Israeli intelligence. And all of that, Hezbollah, any other proxies, all of that is IRGC. It's all IRGC. IRGC run this whole operation for Iran. And it should have been prescribed long ago. And the excuse that the government's given for not doing so is that the IRGC so greatly permeates the whole of the state of Iran, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, that to prescribe the IRGC effectively severs diplomatic relations between the UK and Iran, which we didn't want to do. Now, I would say that we haven't gained anything from. I mean, I'm not privy to to sensitive information from within the government. But as far as I'm aware, we haven't gained anything of benefit to us or anyone else from maintaining diplomatic relations with Iran, and of therefore keeping the IRGC alive. So yeah, I agree with you. It should be gone. It should have been gone long before, and the same with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay. Well, thank you, Richard. It's almost 8:45, so you've given plenty of the time, more than we could have hoped for. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to our Vice Chairman, Lawrence Julius, to do a vote of thanks. So Lawrence, over to you.
Well, what do I say after such an excellent two speakers? I'd like to thank both Richard and Jonathan for a stimulating conversation. The woeful decline of Britain's relevance on the global stage in both soft and hard power, driven by domestic concerns over loss of political support, is quite frightening. Your thoughts on domestic preparedness were again another food for thought. I don't think people perceive the threat from drones and that which is actually ongoing in London, in Britain today. I'm involved with things with the local police, and we've had several incidents of drones doing hostile reconnaissance at synagogues and other places. Some other notes. I would also recommend everyone follows the writing of Jonathan. They're well worth reading every day. And I'd really just like to thank Jonathan and Richard very much again. If you enjoyed tonight's talk, please sign up on the NGA website to get all of our talks and details. We'd like to see you all again. Just repeat what I'm sure you hear said lots of times. The NGA is a voluntary organisation driven by donations, and if you feel you've enjoyed tonight's talk and want to give a donation, it will be much appreciated. I'm just going along finally from Michael Sampson's points about the IRGC and Muslim Brotherhood. The NGA is involved with the campaign on this at present. Britain is the weakest link. Europe has prescribed the IRGC, US has, and the protection is only as strong as the weakest link, and we must put more pressure on the government to prescribe both the Muslim Brotherhood and the IRGC. And thank you very much for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you again soon.
Do you mind if I make a final comment, Lawrence?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for those kind words, and it was a real pleasure joining everybody this evening. I should have at the beginning wished you all a happy Pesach, but I don't know if being a mere goy, I don't know if now is the right time to do it or it's too premature. But in advance, happy Pesach. And I feel absolutely dreadful, I have to say, about the way that many Jews in the UK feel about the situation that they're confronted with at the moment in Britain. I think it's absolutely horrific. But I can tell you that, I mean, there are a lot of non-Jews who feel very badly for you and who are willing to stand up alongside you. Not enough, and it's obviously important we recruit as many as we can. But I think it's a shameful situation that so many of you find yourself in, and certainly I know a number of other people fully support and stand right beside you whenever we possibly can. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Richard. And thank you, Lawrence. Lovely words, Richard. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I will be mailing the recording out tomorrow, and a link for anyone who would like to donate to us, and details of our campaign about the IRGC and Muslim Brotherhood. So thank you very much, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.